Welcome everybody to today's Emerge Africa seminar, part one of e-assessment, presented by Associate Professor Alan Cliff. So Alan is also the coordinator of the Staff Development Cluster in the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching. He teaches courses in educational technology, psychology, educational assessment, and adult education to mostly postgrad education students, and he convenes courses in educational assessment and evaluation for students at various postgraduate levels. And yeah, basically his work has been really influential in areas related to
Okay, thanks very much, Nicola, and thank you to everybody for your attendance and your participation in advance of this during the course of this seminar. Nicola, I don't have anything I'm going to add at this stage. I think let's just leave it at that, and maybe just one other point to add is that I do supervise research students in this area as well. So just putting that out there as well, we do have a field of higher education studies that is based here in SILT, and there are a number of us who do a PhD and master's supervision in fields such as mine, assessment, and various other fields. But I'll leave people to contact us if you're interested in pursuing those routes a little further. As indicated, so just checking first before I continue, am I audible? Can people hear me? You don't have to necessarily agree, but maybe Nicola, you could just say, or Jakob, you could just say whether I'm audible. Okay, all looks fine. Great. So I'll continue. Please just indicate or something if something goes wrong somewhere during the course of the of the audio of the seminar on the audio side. I'm not going to try and respond to everybody's questions or issues that are raised in the chat room or in the chat text on an ongoing basis. What I will undertake to do is every sort of 20 minutes or so, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, is just to stop and check whether there are any particular issues people want to raise. And I'm going to rely on Nicola for that. Nicola, you can maybe just give us some idea of and categorize those questions that people are raising at particular points in the presentation. Okay, as indicated, this is part one of a two-part presentation, and what I want to concentrate on particularly this afternoon is what I'm going to think of, or what I think of as the sort of minimum conditions, if you like, for the use of assessment in online environments, e-assessment in online environments. I'm going to focus on macro, meso, and micro levels, and I'm going to put out or discuss with you, talk through with you what I believe to be the particular affordances of for the use of e-assessment in an online environment, and then I'm also going to pose a series of challenges. So this particular presentation is going to be kind of at the conceptual level, but I think the underlying question I'm asking us to consider here this afternoon is the question of to what extent are these, if you like, minimum levels of minimum conditions, to what extent are these possible in our particular institutional and other environments, and to what extent do we agree that these are kind of minimum conditions for engagement in e-assessment. What I will do in part two next week is engage at a much more specific level in particular e-assessment practices that I believe, or shall I say assessment practices that I believe can be very fruitfully engaged upon in an online environment. I will try to highlight today some of the particular the particular affordances that I believe that an online environment enables for e-assessment, but I also, as I indicated earlier, want to raise some of the challenges that I believe are particularly pertinent in this case as well. Okay, so let's move on. We don't have a great deal of time, and I will keep an eye on the chat as we go along. So when I talk about the macro environment, and I'm hoping now that my slides are moving and you can see the first slide in front of you, I believe that there's certain affordances or there's certain conditions at the moment that make e-assessment a decided possibility. And by macro environment here, I'm referring perhaps to a kind of universal level engagement in matters related to both e-assessment, e-learning in general, and the online environment as a whole. MISO, for me, I'm going to move down at the MISO level to the institutional kind of level. And I'm taking particularly a higher education shape, but I don't see why this couldn't apply also to other institutional levels of engagement. That's what I mean by MISO, so the institutional kinds of levels. And then I'll move on to the micro level, which I'll assume for the purposes of my presentation to be classroom level. So in front of you, you'll see some of the things that I believe to be the affordances within the macro environment. It is clear that there is international interest in online and blended forms of learning and teaching. And I would argue that, and again, I would invite people's critical engagement here. I would argue that this is a universal, but with the universal move towards online and blended forms of learning and teaching, there come certain challenges, and I think we need to be thinking very clearly about what it is in particular that the online environment provides us with that cannot be provided for, say, for example, in the face-to-face environment. The reverse, I think, is also true, that we need to be thinking about what is it that the face-to-face space provides us with that perhaps cannot be provided for in an online or blended form of learning and teaching and assessment. The second point I'm raising here is the point about increasing flexibility of provision. And I think that places particular demands on the assessment in the e-assessment and assessment practice area in general. It suggests to me that we are challenged at this point to think about assessment practices in highly flexible ways as well. And I'm going to introduce some of those particular thoughts a little later on when I move down to the meso and the micro levels of the landscape in which we're operating. But the increased flexibility of provision of learning and teaching in higher education and elsewhere in post-secondary education means that perhaps in a good way there are huge opportunities now to think about assessment in very different ways. So long gone is the idea that assessment, for example, is always necessary written, and I'm sure that some of this is self-evident. And I think it's also, we've moved a long way away from the possibility that assessment is always conducted through pencil and paper, for example. But that provides us with challenges as well, which I'll come to in a little bit further down the line. I think open education as a movement, I'm calling it a movement, I may be wrong in my depiction of it, but I think open education has provided us with a framework for thinking about practice and for doing assessment with a clear indication that clear intention that the possibility of what we do in the educational space is open to people beyond those who have, say, either paid for the provision or who have signed up for courses. And the educational technology space, I think, also gives us opportunities for real affordance in the area of e-assessment. It is very clear to me, and I'm sure it's very clear to many of us, that we can do assessment in many places, on many platforms, and with many different purposes than might have been possible at a time when assessment was practiced in very formal senses and in a static classroom settings, for example. There is increased interest in and uptake of online educational offerings. And so I think this provides us again with a favorable climate in which to consider our own practices. But I want us all to be thinking as we go through this presentation, to what extent do these spaces, these macro spaces, actually enable practices in our own institutional and classroom contexts? In other words, to what extent are these things genuinely affordances, or might it be that in many cases these are not affordances but problems that have to be dealt with, an increased demand, if you like, for the delivery of online provision that we can't necessarily deliver in our own spaces. Okay, moving on a little bit further to a few more affordances. I think higher education, and I'm sticking to higher education, but I'm asking you also, inviting you also to apply this to other contexts in which you might be practicing. Higher education policy and strategy increasingly supports online provision. Of course, the concomitant challenge there is, does it indeed do so across all contexts? There may be places where there is no policy or there are no strategies to support online provision. And what I'm suggesting by implication here is that if these things are not in place, there is a high degree of chance that assessment and online provision are not going to be supported. I think there are appetites for and affordances of MOOCs, massive open online courses, that provide us again with a favorable climate in which to consider a variety of assessment practices from along an informal to formal spectrum, and along a continuum from highly formative assessment practices to possibilities of summative assessment. And I know that there are challenges in the summative assessment space with regard to online assessment. For example, questions around security and privacy and those kinds of things, and identity of those participants who participate in these open and online courses. I want to move now specifically into the assessment space, and to say that I believe that a strong affordance for the use of assessment in online spaces is that there is international research on learning theory and in social learning that enables us to think about the particular affordances of the online space. But I do want to make a point here that I hope people will engage with as we move along, and that is that I'm not sure that we are terribly clear about what we mean currently in terms of the space around social learning. I think of social learning much more as a context, a favorable context for learning, and a favorable space in which learning can take place using networking and other opportunities. But I'm not sure that educational psychology or other disciplines has enabled us to understand learning, the processes of social learning clearly enough. I will come back to this point a little bit further along the line when I talk about challenges and so on for e-assessment. I think that there are huge universal opportunities for learning networks and the development of learning networks. This, for me, strongly signals that it is possible to benefit from, for example, assessment that capitalizes on peer-to-peer feedback, that capitalizes highly on formative assessment and on assessment which promotes learning, promotes and facilitates learning. So assessment is not necessarily only about providing some kind of summative grading on performance, but much more an opportunity for people to learn from one another, to obtain good feedback and informed feedback from one another as students as well as lecturers, and using those opportunities in an e-space, I think, are far potentially much more favorable than those spaces might be in the face-to-face context. In my particular institution, and I think elsewhere in this country and elsewhere in the world, policy and strategy around e-assessment is clearly going to be a driver and continue to be a driver and a supporter of e-assessment as practice. If the landscape doesn't allow for policy and strategy, it is likely that there will be that e-assessment and assessment in general is going to be taken up in idiosyncratic or random kinds of ways, or perhaps incoherent ways in terms of an institutional response to these issues. And then I think finally there is international theory and research on assessment practice that enables us to think very carefully about what assessment is doing. And by the way, for those of you who are talking about this in the chat room, I'm going to talk much more closely in part 2 next week around the purposes of assessment, and to focus very specifically on assessment as a process around facilitating learning. For example, using feedback and using feedback in multiple ways. But I think the international theory and research space overall does provide us with a really good framework for engaging in assessment practices in online spaces. I'm going to chase on a little to the challenges, and then I'm going to take a moment to look at some of the questions people are raising. I think the first biggest challenge we have internationally, and in particular in Africa and in this country, South Africa, there are massive inequalities in access and the uptake of resources and online practices. This for me is a fundamental given, and should be taken consideration of in a very careful way in any kind of design of assessment practices in both online and in face-to-face contexts, but in particular in online spaces. It is highly likely that students do not equally engage, either in terms of the issues of resourcing or in terms of their being able to engage in the literacies of e-assessment practices for us to believe that these things are distributed, if you like, equally across all contexts. I think second challenge that I want to raise is that there are distinct dangers in the current context of uncritical engagement in the online learning environment. And what I mean by that in particular is the possibility that people engage in online learning and e-assessment as if it were simply a case of transferring what is done in face-to-face environments into online spaces. There are distinct differences for me and in terms of theory around the online space, and in particular I think in relation to the issue of student agency, which we need to be taking careful consideration of. Okay, opening up the online space and opening up assessment practices to online spaces poses the potential for unregulated competition for resources and for the market. We've already begun, and I don't wish to sound reactionary here. I'm not suggesting that private provision and opening up the higher educational space to a variety of players is a bad thing. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting that there's the possibility that it is unregulated, and therefore that poses issues around quality control and others. So, for example, what do we do when in a particular institution, someone outside provider, for example, suggests to us that they will be able to do assessment for us and take that burden, if you want to call it that, away from our own practice? How do we quality assure that? How do we think about what they're offering us, and how do we actually then make decisions about whose role it is to do the assessment, for example, and what role outside providers will play? I mean, the same could be said of people who coach students to respond to assessment, for example, to assessment tasks. How do we regulate? Do we intervene in those processes? Do we see ourselves as playing a role in contributing, or perhaps quality assuring those processes, contributing to or quality assuring those processes? I think that there are huge infrastructural and expertise challenges in the area, particularly of e-assessment. It's really, I mean, I'm seeing comments being made here by people about multiple choice assessment, for example. There's a huge international industry around the development of multiple choice questions that are amenable to assessment on e-platforms, for example. What does that actually mean in infrastructural terms, and what does it mean for expertise? Because it's clear, certainly from that literature, that there's considerable expertise in the design of the assessments in those spaces, as expertise required in the design of those spaces, but also expertise required in the interpretation of the results that students obtain on those kinds of assessments. I do also want to engage much more with more open-ended assessment at next week's part 2 as well. And then I think there's also finally, and in this slide, uncritical engagement in learning theory and contexts. So often people assume, and I made the point about the difference between, say, social learning and learning theory. There's often an assumption that learning theory is automatically built into assessment as a process. So once we set an assessment, we're setting an assessment of a respectable theory about learning, and that may not be true. That may not necessarily be true. I think it's also possible that context can be engaged within uncritical spaces. So that was my idea about it. We need to be careful about not simply wanting to transfer face-to-face type assessment into online environments. Finally, on the challenges side, I've made this point already. Little understanding of the differences between face-to-face and online learning. And I think it's also possible that we're entering a phase now of open season on the offering of higher education provision. I've hinted at this already too. The policy, the whole area of learning analytics, which itself provides very interesting opportunities for assessing students in an online space. One can very easily collect data in an online space about student performance, about how students are understanding what they're learning, about the qualitatively different ways in which they are being assessed, and giving and understanding particular concepts. But it could be potentially that this is, as I say, open season, and that we are not necessarily either able to offer the kinds of detailed support for students off the learning analytics, or that we are provided with, as it were, off-the-shelf feedback on students' assessment achievement through the use of analytics that we're not necessarily able to engage with critically. Curriculum, assessment, student support, and so on are other such features of HE provision that have become very open, and as I hint here, or I mention here, the unbundling process. I've pointed you to a URL there where this notion of unbundling in higher education is being explored in a systematic way in a research project.
Alan. Yes,
context.
there were quite a few interesting questions, possibly more to do with the microenvironment, which I suppose you're getting to next.
Okay.
So we had
Let me
a
stop
question
with the
by Jerome
macroenvironment for a moment.
What kinds of assessments are possible for online discussion
Nicola
forums?
on some of the issues which people are raising, and
what about e-assessment for large classes? Similarly, Gabriel had
Nicola,
a question around MCQs and how what would work better for some structured questions or more essay types of answers. Jerome also spoke about assessment driving participation.
Yeah.
And Kate had a comment about the boundaries and responsibilities involved in collaborative engagements. And Gabriel then also had a question around e-assessment for students with disabilities.
Yeah. Okay, it's going to be difficult for me to respond to all the questions in this short session, but yes, I will focus more on some of these issues that people are raising when I come to the microenvironment, which I see as the classroom environment, and also very specifically in part 2 in next week's session. The reason I'm going the current route is that I feel that it's important for us to locate e-assessment in this broader landscape, and to be aware of both the affordances and constraints on the system before we move down into the more micro levels. I do want to pick up on one issue about the inequalities. I mean, inequalities here express themselves in very specific ways in the South African higher education space, for example. And they are things like inequalities around access. So students may not have equal opportunities to engage in e-learning and to respond to e-assessment tasks because of those issues around access. There are also infrastructural type equalities. There are, if you like, market type equalities. And I would imagine that some people in this presentation can refer to their own institutional context and say There are places in their institution where it is simply not possible for e-assessment to be carried out or taken to scale, for example, because of the absence of infrastructure and the absence of expertise. And I'm saying that these things, in particular expertise around what assessment is for, and expertise around student learning and learning theory, become absolutely critical if one is going to design effective and meaningful e-assessment processes and practices. I think let's just move on a little further into the MESA environment, and I'm going to try not to repeat some of the points I've raised originally, and then we can maybe open up further comments, questions, and I can take some more, make some more responses to people's comments. At the MESA level, I think it's critical, if one is going to think about e-assessment and develop e-assessment systems and so on, that there be institutional buy-in and support through policy and strategy. At the micro level, one could argue, well, lecturers can continue and they can embark upon e-assessment practices and develop particular forms of e-assessment without necessarily the full institutional buy-in. I think what I'm suggesting here is that, as I'm saying at the top of my slide, that the institutional buy-in becomes an affordance. It means that the institution as a whole supports the notion of assessment, first of all, and e-assessment in particular, and gives resources to this process, as well as provides opportunities for people to be trained further, to learn further, and so on. Sorry, I repeat what I meant by MESA environment here, as I'm thinking of this as an institutional level environment. So the macro was the big, broad universals. The MESA environment here, the level of the institution, so the kind of middle level of engagement in educational provision. I think another distinct affordance of the at the middle level, at the MESA environment, is well-developed assessment systems and policies. It really makes no sense for us to be working only bottom up in our own kinds of classroom practices if we're not being supported through the development, through the existence of well-developed assessment systems and policies in the institution as a whole. And the same is true in my third point for well-developed educational practices and processes. I think also that at the institutional level, it's helpful and useful for there to be increasingly blended forms of provision. And this is being given structural signals in the higher education context in this country, and I assume elsewhere outside of this country as well. And then finally, there is increasing engagement with online and blended forms of assessment. Okay, moving on to the challenges in the MESA environment, the institutional environment. By comparison with good infrastructure settings where infrastructure is good, there may be huge challenges around poor infrastructure and policy or strategic support. So it's kind of the reverse is also possible. The first, good infrastructure provides us with opportunities and affordances. Poor infrastructure is a distinct challenge at this level. I think that a distinct challenge in institutional environments is that there is relatively poor understanding of learning and assessment theory and practices. Assessment is considered sometimes in very simplistic terms to be just about formal and summative assessment. It's not necessarily engaged with as a mechanism for promoting and facilitating learning. I also think that people don't necessarily understand assessment to be a process of thinking through, or rather, enabling understanding of the qualitatively different ways in which students learn. So it's not just, for example, about working out how much students learn, but as much working out what students have actually learned and in what ways their learning has changed and shifted as a result of assessment practice. These things are not necessarily thought through in very clear ways at institutional level, and those things therefore become challenges in the environment. And there are particular challenges in an e-learning environment. I mean, if, for example, and we will talk again more about this next week, if, for example, it is possible to put assessment online online and to have all students participate in the assessment, and this is possible through particularly formative assessment, if people don't understand the goal of the assessment and what it is that they want students to learn, how are we then able to make judgments about the extent to which students have learned and the extent to which students differ from one another in terms of their learning? In dynamic assessment theory, for example, it is clear that it is possible to structure assessment opportunities at, say, subgroup level, where students who have particularly different learning needs or needs to learn different things can be put, as it were, put together in online environments in order to learn off one another and to be given different kinds of assessment that enables these things to happen. I will again talk more of this, but I'm just introducing the concept here and suggesting that dynamic assessment as a form of assessment in an online space, for me, holds particular promises. It also holds challenges, obviously, but I'm suggesting that we go and have a look, for example, at the work of Robert Sternberg in the United States and the work of people like Matthew Perner, who's also currently based in the US, for a better understanding, perhaps, of how dynamic assessment can function as a form of mediated and facilitated assessment practice, giving students very specific feedback about what they've learned and how they could improve and so on the basis of assessment. By the way, I think in e-assessment spaces, this kind of feedback is made even more possible because these things are recorded. Students reflect on their assessment in an e-space and they can be given specific feedback either by lecturers or by students themselves, their peers, provided, and we will talk again further about this, provided that those peers do have an understanding of what they're giving feedback about. So they need to be informed learners and informed about the assessment too in order to make those judgments. Then I think another challenge is that there's often poor understanding of the different forms and purposes of assessment. For example, the differences between oral and written assessment. What is it about particular written assessment that make it particularly favorable in promoting a particular kind of learning and, in fact, in enabling us to assess that learning? So this really goes to the kind of, for example, to the formative summative continuum. And I would argue to the informal and formal practices of assessment too. Then I think of another challenge in the meso environment is poor understanding of students and student agency. So this, I think, is a strong challenge, especially in the online environment. So the questions that this raises for me are questions around to what extent do we enable students to fully engage in an online environment? What kinds of students, if you like, best engage in online learning environments, and which kinds of students best respond to online assessment activities, for example. I think we need to be conscious of that because it may be that kind of that a lack of student agency provides us with the danger of students not engaging fully in the assessment processes or not perceiving the value of the assessment, which is the last point I make on this slide, the perceived value of assessment. Assessment is seen in some cases as tacked on at the end of a course. If that is so, it's very unlikely that it's going to be perceived as having a learning function or as enabling and facilitating learning. Okay, Nicola, again, I'm going to stop here. Maybe just do some summation, if possible, around some of the things which people are raising in the chat. I'd see this concept of a very important concept around assessment for learning versus assessment of learning. I see that as strongly related to the differences between formative and summative assessment. I see summative assessment as a kind of, if you like, a snapshot view of assessment. We are making a judgment about students learning at a particular point in time.
Yes, I think there were some interesting reflections on the student experiences of feedback. So Jerome spoke about how sometimes assessment without feedback can be quite frustrating
that we have
for
various
students.
Opportunities to make judgments about the assessment. Okay, sorry, I did ask you, Nicola, to give us some idea of some of the comments and themes emerging from today's presentation.
Yes, I just wanted to say it's around the students' experiences of
Sure. Can I take these one at a time? Otherwise, I lose the thread of what is being raised. So to me, that's sorry. Okay. So that to me, the student agency issue comes into this as well. So I think there are greater risks in an online environment for students to believe that assessment is being done to them rather than for them and with them. And that's part of that difficulty. If yes, indeed, if students are not provided with good feedback through an assessment task that has, say, been placed online, for example, like a tutorial which has been placed online and students are in groups responding to particular tasks, it's very difficult for students then to perceive the value of that assessment practice. This does not necessarily mean that we place more emphasis, if you like, sorry, that all the work has to be done by ourselves, for example, as lecturers. It is quite possible that in an informed way, students can learn to give feedback to one another, provided that they are guided on the kinds of feedback that is expected. I mean, for example, I can give a very specific example where in some MOOC situations, students, for example, provide feedback to one another that have to do with handwriting and, say, the format in which they've typed their responses to a task. I think it's useful and easy
Yes,
for us
so there
then
was
to
a
build from
question
there
around
to say to students, okay, that's not kind of
suggestions
the
for
level of
how does
feedback
one
we're
provide
expecting.
meaningful
We're asking
feedback
for
to
feedback
large
more at the level of the
classes
conceptual
without
understanding of
giving the
students or the
sense that the
degree to which the
feedback
students have
is
been able to apply
impersonal
from one
or
situation to
automated?
another and so on. So
Perhaps this
that
is at
kind
the
of
micro level that you want to
feedback
keep for
support to the
later.
student process is really important in mediating this. Sorry, Nicola, anything else at this stage? Okay. No, I will respond now. I think it will come up again more in more detail as we go along through today and next week. At minimum, I think we as lecturers are well placed to have a good understanding of the different kinds of misconceptions, misunderstandings, and strengths and weaknesses that students show in a particular assessment activity. So if we do nothing else, it is possible to take that to scale. So to say, for example, let's assume that at least 1/3 of the class is going to have conceptual difficulties with what is being taught. So we can tailor the feedback to that 1/3 of the class along the lines of the conceptual understanding problem that we think might be surfacing. Another third, perhaps, of the students may be grappling with and having difficulties with application, and we may want to tailor our feedback to those groups, and so on by extension. I think where the e-assessment platform provides us particularly helpful opportunities is we can then subsequently structure interventions, mediations, and feedback along the lines, say, of those particular subgroups and invite students to self-identify. In other words, define particular places that they want to gain more, if you like. So if particular students feel that their own conceptual understanding is lacking on the basis of the feedback they've received at the classroom level or the whole class level, they would then be able to sign up particularly for formative and supportive assessment and feedback around that particular issue in an online environment. And that can be mediated quite strongly and probably more efficiently, if you like, and more effectively than it can be, say, in a face-to-face
comment around
type environment.
standardized tests.
So that would be one technique, one
again,
approach that
classes.
one could take to reducing the level of impersonal feedback and also structuring further feedback along the lines of the particular difficulty students are having. Anything else just from your side? Just perhaps one more before we move into part 3. Just having a look at yeah, there's plenty of literature that can be looked at in relation to standardized assessments in large classes and taking this into an online space. I mean, apart from the infrastructural issues that people might be grappling with and having difficulty with, well, I think the literature, the research in the area tells us that if we're going to do standardized assessment, and by standardized here we mean standardized, everybody, as it were, writes the same test. I'm going to come back to that point in a second. Or takes the same multiple choice assessment, or does the same particular, say, essay in an online space. That's what is meant by standardized. The challenge there, though, is, I think, to make sure that the standardized test artifact, instrument, whatever it is, has different versions, because it's going to be very difficult, for example, from a security point of view, and challenging from an identity point of view, to ensure that security and confidentiality are maintained in those environments. I would encourage people to look, for example, at both computer adaptive testing and computerized forms of testing. There's quite a lot of literature in the field. I find the computer adaptive teaching particularly interesting, because it helps us to see that it is possible for assessment in an online space to be responsive to students' levels of understanding and learning, and so therefore for the different questions which students have to respond to being given to students differently according to their own levels of understanding, and I find that particularly useful. So it's computerized assessment, yes, and or computer adaptive testing is the word I was using, computer adaptive testing. So the test itself responding to the levels of response that students are making in the online environment. Again, those are words that people could Google and have a look at what is on offer in those kinds of environments. Okay, I'm going to move into part 3, and then hopefully there's still time for more general kinds of discussion points to be raised. And again, to repeat, what I'm stressing here is the macro and meso environmental elements, and now the micro, when I move to them, are really important preconditions for the establishment of good assessment practices in online spaces. Okay, so the micro. What I think the micro does enable, or does allow us to do in terms of assessment in an online space. Firstly, online environments are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. So mobile phones, mobile technology, social learning spaces, social media, networked learning spaces, these things are all possible in an assessment environment, and potentially therefore become spaces and platforms in which assessment practice can occur. And again, I'm just reminding people that I'm talking here about informal as well as formal assessment, and I'm talking about different forms of assessment as well, and different purposes. So quick quizzes, quick feedback moments, polls, those kinds of things are just as much assessment practices as any other kind of formal assessment, and give us really quick and useful feedback about the extent to which students have learned something. So, for example, one is teaching a particular concept in a class. One puts up a slide that says, here are some different understandings of the concept. Which of those particular understandings do you agree with or support? Vote now. And students can vote, and on the basis of that can be given feedback about the particular conceptual understandings that have been presented in those online spaces. And they can get immediate feedback about whether they're right or wrong, but more importantly, not only that they're right or wrong, but why perhaps a particular conception is not as plausible or complete as a conception in another case. And by the by, this is also possible in spaces where we're not only testing for knowledge. One can test reasoning this way as well, and provide students with feedback about reasoning, where it's not about just right or wrong answers, but about particular kinds of reasoning that might be more either inclusive or plausible in certain contexts than other kinds of learning. So it's not just cases where one is testing for a knowledge acquisition. One might also be testing for understanding, or for conceptual acquisition, or for reasoning abilities. I think also that there are possibilities in the micro space. That is, sorry, by micro here I mean classroom practice. Yes, thanks Nicola for including that. there are also possibilities for the recording of assessment practices and processes. So tasks can be online. Student responses to those tasks can be online. Their feedback to one another and from the lecturer can be placed online. These are things that students can revisit and can look at on other occasions, and these can all be supportive in the microenvironment to assessment practices. And I think the microenvironment finally provides us particular affordances for doing more than simply lecturer-directed assessment. There are possibilities for peer-to-peer assessment, student to lecturer or lecturer to student, as well as self-assessment. By student to lecturer, I mean I'm thinking particularly of assessment where lecturers are obtaining feedback about their own teaching practice, for example, which is a somewhat of a departure from what we've been talking about up to now. Okay, moving on to my final slide. The challenges in the microenvironment, that is at the classroom level, I think are many, but I'm not suggesting that they are insurmountable. And certainly when we talk in more detail about some examples next week, I'm hoping that we can engage in more of these things. There again, we're back to the inequalities issue. There are structural inequalities, there are student inequalities, there are access inequalities, etc., that potentially or actually bedevil the microenvironments in which assessment is taking place. So if students can't get online, for example, or students are unable to access the online space outside of, say, the institution in which they're studying, those are particular constraints that may block or prevent us from doing assessment creating assessment practices that students can benefit from at any time and anywhere. I've made this point in the macro and the meso context before. I think there's the danger of uncritical adoption of online or blended provision and assessment practices. Back to a point that I will raise very in detail next week, we need to understand exactly what it is that we're trying to assess before we actually consider placing that assessment activity into an online space, so that we can better interpret and understand what comes back from students on the basis of the assessment that we do. So a very simple example is we need to be very clear that there are differences between asking, for example, how questions and asking why questions. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about in understanding the assessment that we do. There are huge literacies challenges in higher education, simply put at the levels of digital literacy, academic literacy, writing literacies, oral literacies, and the like, which may all be amplified in a micro environment, in a space in which it is assumed that assessment, for example, is understood uniformly by the students taking the assessment. Then the student agency and access issues. I've raised the access issues before. I think I've also talked about the student agency issues. There is research evidence that students who do not engage appropriately, meaningfully, even often enough in the online environment do not benefit from that environment as much as others. Now that may be self-evident or seem pretty obvious in some cases, but the problem there is that if we place formative assessment activity into an online space on the assumption that students are going to benefit, we need to be very careful to monitor exactly which students do benefit from that online formative assessment. Who are the students who take up the opportunity, for example, to do a formative task as preparation for a final assessment, a task which has been placed online, and so on. The tips and tricks approach is I think, potentially problematic in an assessment space. Often, and not surprisingly, it's perfectly reasonable, busy colleagues, overwhelmed and overloaded colleagues would like to have engagement with the how-tos of assessment in a relatively uncritical space. It's very difficult for one to provide suggestions about practice in assessment practices in an online space that without thinking about how does the context actually influence that assessment. What is possible in my own context? What kinds of learning do I want to promote through assessment in my own context? what are students most struggling with in my own context that I think assessment can help me gain more information about and understanding into. And then I think finally that there are problematic understandings of assessment practices, and that's kind of what I was raising with this last point. Okay, I think I'm going to stop with the presentation side of this at this point, and let's move now more into engaging with some of the questions and the comments people are raising. Some of the things perhaps I've not raised before. There's a comment coming up here around rubrics, and I think that's very critical. If one is going to do assessment in an online space, one is also concomitantly going to need to place rubrics into that online space as well, and much more importantly, engage with those rubrics with students so that they understand the goals of a particular kind of assessment and can get feedback in light of that assessment. Again, I think the online space provides us with really useful opportunities to do that. One can put annotated rubrics, for example, online after an assessment event, where students can benefit from the feedback in that
yes,
space.
so Tony had a really interesting
question
around,
or takes the dynamic assessment,
you know, student access and whether we
from there,
do we hold off as educators and e-learning practitioners, do we hold off on developing e-assessment practices until we're certain that
you,
all
Nicola,
students have good access
in particular, or perhaps
to these practices?
Yeah,
so do we wait?
Anything thematically that you want to raise at this stage that I could respond to? Okay, that's a really interesting and tricky question to respond to, because at one level, I suppose one could say yes, one does have to wait, because otherwise one is. I suppose a more appropriate response in that is to decide that practice needs to be mixed in terms of its model. So for those students who cannot access, say, the e-environment, then some other forms of assessment activity and feedback need to be provided for and arranged. That becomes really tricky, obviously, in distance education, when spaces where students are virtually present and are not able to be physically present in particular learning spaces. I don't know what other people feel. Maybe the people have had to struggle with that. My inclination is to say go for something that is a mixed model. In other words, enable all students to have access to the assessment activity regardless of where they are, but it would have to mean adaptation. If e-assessment is the default position, as you're suggesting in your question, shouldn't our assessment practice take this as the default? Yes, I think we have to take as default that we'll never have students who all have equal access. So we will need to continue facing that challenge. I'd also like to hear from people around at the macro, meso, and micro levels. What are they seeing from what I'm saying here that they believe to be strong challenges to the possibilities of taking assessment practice into an online space? I'm wondering about, for example, the issues I've raised around understanding of the theory of assessment, for example. Is that not, to me, my experience in my own institution is that's a really underdeveloped space. People see assessment as kind of just the end goal at the end of a course. They do not necessarily think of assessment as facilitating learning, as enabling learning to take place along the line. Stefan, I take your point about the support staff ending up having to do many of these things in order to ensure the mixed model. I'm not sure I'm not sure how one can respond to this. I mean, the assumption is that students all need to have access to the assessment or the course content and the like. I'm not sure how else one can do that. Perhaps, maybe using student support one another, those kinds of things to enable creating opportunities for students to meet around texts and around particular assessment activities in groups. in spaces of physical face-to-face spaces or in online spaces. It is difficult though to think about where the workload ends up lying in those kinds of cases. I like this idea of using WhatsApp to chat around particular online assessments so students have a chance to engage with this. This also gives us a chance, I think, as lecturers to think about, to watch the feedback that students give and to monitor what it's telling us about their understandings through that particular assessment practice. Fantastic idea. Yeah, I like this notion of ethics of care too. I think that part of the assumption around blended learning is that we need to think both of the intended consequences as well as the unintended consequences. Last year, for example, many students were resentful of the fact that we placed material online for them to access because they felt that we were selling out a particular transformation agenda that they were trying to foster through the roads must fall, fees must fall, and the campus shutdown movements. So these are dilemmas. These are ethical as well as practical dilemmas that we have to deal with in a space like this. I also like, Nicola, your original idea further up around the possibility of continuing to discuss these things in a Facebook context, discuss these issues. But I'm also particularly interested in people saying something perhaps more around how they see the challenges and the affordances of what I've raised within the context of this seminar. Okay, I'm pretty much completed with my particular presentation. That was part one. Part two, I'm hoping to engage, like I said earlier, with more around the purposes of assessment, why we do
Thank
it,
you very
what
much,
we do
Alan.
it for, what kinds of
very
assessment we
active
might engage with,
webinar, a
people's
lot of
particular
discussion.
practices in the
Folks
field,
are
how they
starting
take
to
these
even
things into
share
online
examples
spaces.
and practices from their own
I
context
hope
in the
I've
text chat.
set the
Folks, if I can
landscape
ask you to
sufficiently for people to
please
be
continue
bringing
doing
lots
so
of
in the Facebook event
useful and important personal
page. I've
examples to
put a
the
link
space next
there.
time when we actually
Folks who,
engage.
and some people who attended
Nicholas,
last
over to
week
you.
Webinar series may see some overlaps, like Alan mentioned, the ethics of care. And those who may have missed those, you can catch up on recordings via the YouTube channel. I'd also like to say that we are still inviting some very late applications for the facilitating online course. So it's a fully online course on online facilitation. And the link I'm sharing over here. But I realize it's nearly on 2 o'clock, and I'd like to say thank you to Alan for this really interesting presentation, and for all those who joined us here today.